My stepsister took credit for all my achievements until one moment exposed everything. My stepsister Rebecca moved in when our parents married and immediately started taking credit for everything I did because she was 17 and I was 14, so people just believed her. It started small with Rebecca claiming she'd helped me with homework that I'd done completely alone. She'd wait until I went to bed, then show my parents my math assignments saying, "Look what I taught Jessie today, isn't she improving?" Taking credit for grades I earned myself while making me look like I needed her help. When I baked cookies for a school fundraiser, Rebecca took them and told everyone she'd made them and let me help measure ingredients. She stood there accepting compliments on my grandmother's recipe while I was in the bathroom. When I came back, people were thanking me for helping my talented sister. She did this with everything. I painted a portrait for art class and Rebecca posted it online saying, "Teaching my little sister to paint finally paying off, look what she made with my guidance." I'd never taken a single lesson from her, she didn't even own paintbrushes. When I won a short story competition, Rebecca told everyone she'd edited it extensively and basically rewrote the whole thing. The teacher asked me why I hadn't credited my sister for her help, and I looked crazy saying I'd written every word myself. Rebecca was older and more confident, so everyone just assumed she was being modest when she said, "Jessie deserves the credit, I just helped a little." But she'd never even read it before I submitted it. My parents completely bought into this narrative. They'd praise Rebecca for being such a dedicated sister, always helping me succeed. They'd tell relatives that I was lucky to have Rebecca's tutoring, or I'd never achieve anything. Rebecca would fake humility saying, "Jessie has potential, she just needs direction," while stealing every accomplishment I worked for. When I learned to play guitar, Rebecca suddenly claimed she'd been teaching me for months. I'd taught myself from YouTube videos in my room with headphones on, but Rebecca convinced everyone she was some guitar virtuoso who'd graciously shared her knowledge. She couldn't play a single chord, but nobody ever asked her to prove it. The worst part was how she'd undermine me while stealing credit. She'd tell people, "Jessie tries so hard, but she needs a lot of support to get things right," making it seem like I was some struggling kid who needed her superior guidance to function. Teachers started talking to me slower, like I was challenged, because Rebecca had convinced them I couldn't understand things without her help. This went on for over 2 years. 2 years of Rebecca claiming my achievements while simultaneously making me look incompetent. I started hiding my projects and submitting homework directly to teachers without bringing it home. But Rebecca always found ways to insert herself into my accomplishments. She'd show up at my presentations claiming she'd coached me. She'd tell judges at science fairs that she'd helped design my experiments. She even tried to accept an award on my behalf, once saying I was too shy to speak publicly. Everything imploded at the regional talent show. I'd been secretly preparing a piano piece for months, practicing at school where Rebecca couldn't claim she'd taught me. It was a complicated classical composition that required serious skill. Rebecca didn't even know I'd entered until she saw the program. She immediately started telling everyone she'd been teaching me piano since we became sisters. The other competitors' parents were impressed, asking Rebecca how long she'd been playing. She made up this elaborate story about studying at conservatory before her parents' divorce forced her to quit. She said teaching me helped her stay connected to music, and she was so proud I'd learned this piece she'd personally selected for my skill level. She had no idea what piece I was playing. When my turn came, I walked onto the stage and the announcer said, "Next we have Jessie performing Chopin's Ballad No. 1 in G minor, taught by her sister Rebecca." I stopped at the microphone and said, "Actually, I need to make a correction. Rebecca has never taught me piano. I've been taking lessons from Mrs. Yoshida at school for 3 years." The announcer looked confused and Rebecca stood up in the audience. "Jessie's just nervous, she doesn't want people to think she had help, but I've been working with her for months on this piece." That's when Mrs. Yoshida stood up. "That's interesting, Rebecca, because I've been teaching Jessie privately and I've never seen you at any of her lessons. Can you tell us what key this piece is in?" Rebecca went red and said, "I don't need to prove anything." Mrs. Yoshida continued, "The piece is in G minor, moving through multiple key modulations. Since you selected it for Jessie's skill level, surely you can tell us about the polyrhythms in the third section?" Rebecca stammered something about not remembering technical details. Someone's parent, who was a piano teacher, called out, "If you taught her this piece, you'd know it's one of Chopin's most difficult works. Nobody who can play this would forget those details." I sat at the piano and said, "Rebecca can't play piano. She can't play guitar either, or paint, or write, or do any of the things she's claimed to teach me. I'm going to perform now, and when I'm done, I challenge Rebecca to play even a basic scale." I played the piece perfectly. All those months of secret practice paid off, and the audience was completely silent until the last note. Then they erupted in applause. The judge stood up and said, "Rebecca, would you like to demonstrate any musical ability at all?" Rebecca's face turned bright red, and she looked around the auditorium like she was searching for an escape route. Penelope Harden stood up from her seat in the third row and repeated her question in a louder voice, asking what the polyrhythms were in the third section of the piece I'd just performed. The silence stretched out for what felt like forever, while everyone stared at Rebecca waiting for her answer. People started whispering to each other, and I could see some of them pulling out their phones, probably looking up information about the Chopin piece. Rebecca stammered something about not needing to prove herself to strangers, and her voice cracked in the middle of the sentence. She grabbed her purse from the seat next to her and practically ran up the aisle toward the exit doors. The heavy auditorium doors slammed behind her and the sound echoed through the whole room. I sat frozen at the piano bench watching her leave, and my hands were still shaking from playing the piece and from what had just happened. My palms felt sweaty against my thighs and I could feel my heart pounding, so hard I thought everyone could probably hear it. Mrs. Yoshida walked up onto the stage, and the click of her shoes on the wood floor was the only sound in the completely silent auditorium. She turned to face the audience and started explaining in her calm teacher voice that she'd been my piano instructor for 3 full years, meeting twice a week after school. She said Rebecca had never attended a single one of my lessons, or shown any knowledge about music theory or piano technique. Mrs. Yoshida pulled out her phone and showed the screen to the judges, explaining that she kept detailed records of every student's progress, including attendance logs and payment receipts. One of the judges stood up and asked if I could stay after the show ended, because they needed to discuss what had just occurred. My parents were sitting about halfway back in the auditorium, and I could see Mom's face looked pale and shocked while Dad had his arms crossed over his chest. They kept looking at each other and then back at the stage like they couldn't believe what they were hearing. The rest of the talent show continued, but I barely paid attention to the other performers because my mind was racing through everything that might happen next. When the last act finished, the judges went into a small room backstage to make their decisions, while everyone in the audience talked in loud voices about what they'd just witnessed. I stayed sitting on the piano bench because I didn't know where else to go, and several people came up to tell me my performance was beautiful. After about 15 minutes, the judges came back out and announced the winners, starting with 3rd place. When they got to 1st place, they called my name and said I'd demonstrated exceptional technical skill and emotional depth in one of the most challenging pieces in the classical piano repertoire. I walked up to accept the trophy, but the victory felt completely hollow because I could see my parents standing in the lobby through the auditorium doors, and their expressions looked angry instead of proud. Mom was shaking her head and talking to Dad with big hand gestures, and I knew I was in serious trouble. After I talked to the judges for a few minutes about what happened with Rebecca, they let me go, and I walked out to the lobby where my parents were waiting. Mom immediately started asking why I would embarrass Rebecca like that in front of hundreds of people, instead of just talking to her privately at home. Dad said we needed to leave right now and go home for a family meeting about my behavior. I tried to explain that Rebecca had been lying about teaching me piano for months, but Mom cut me off, saying this wasn't the time or place for excuses. We walked to the parking lot and I could feel tears starting to burn behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Rebecca had already left with her aunt who'd been sitting in the back row, so it was just the 3 of us driving home. The car ride felt like it took forever, even though our house was only 10 minutes from the school. Nobody said anything for the first few minutes, and I stared out the window watching the streetlights pass by in a blur. Then Mom broke the silence by saying she was so disappointed in me for choosing to humiliate my sister instead of sharing credit graciously like a good person would. I opened my mouth to explain that Rebecca never taught me anything about piano, but Dad interrupted, saying we would discuss everything at home, and I needed to stop talking right now. His voice had that edge to it that meant he was really mad, and arguing would only make things worse. I slumped down in the back seat and wrapped my arms around myself, feeling cold, even though the car heater was on. Rebecca had ridden home separately with her aunt who'd driven to the show, so she was probably already at the house telling her side of the story and making herself look like the victim. When we got home, Rebecca was sitting in the living room on the big couch with red puffy eyes like she'd been crying the whole drive. She looked up when we walked in and her face crumpled like she was about to start crying again. Before my parents could even take their coats off, Rebecca started talking in this shaky voice about how I'd been secretly planning this ambush for months because I was jealous of her. She said she'd only been trying to help build my confidence by giving me credit publicly, and now I'd repaid her kindness by making her look like a liar in front of everyone. Mom sat down next to Rebecca and put an arm around her shoulders, while Dad stood with his arms crossed looking between us. Rebecca kept talking, saying she'd worked so hard to be a good sister and help me succeed, and this was how I thanked her. Mom was nodding along like Rebecca's story made perfect sense, and I felt panic rising in my chest because they were actually buying this revised version of events. I pulled my phone out of my pocket with shaking hands and opened the Photos app where I'd saved a picture of my piano lesson registration form from 3 years ago. I held the phone out to Dad and told him to look at the date and Mrs. Yoshida's signature, proving I'd been taking lessons since before Rebecca even knew I was interested in piano. Dad took my phone and examined the image, closely zooming in on the details, while Rebecca insisted from the couch that the form didn't prove anything about who had taught me at home. Mom suggested that maybe Rebecca had helped me practice at home, even if I'd taken formal lessons at the school, and that would explain why she felt like she'd been teaching me. I wanted to scream that Rebecca had never helped me with anything ever, but I knew getting emotional would just make me look like I was the problem. Dad's phone rang and he looked at the screen before answering and walking into the kitchen for privacy. I could hear his muffled voice through the wall but couldn't make out the words. Rebecca used the opportunity to tell Mom in a quiet voice, that I'd always been competitive with her, and jealous that she was older and more accomplished. Mom stroked Rebecca's hair and made soothing sounds while I stood there feeling invisible. After what felt like forever, Dad came back into the living room with a strange expression on his face. He'd been on the phone with Mrs. Yoshida for 40 minutes, and she'd provided detailed records of every single lesson I'd taken, including dates, times, payments, and lists of every piece I'd learned. Mrs. Yoshida had explained to him that she'd specifically asked me multiple times over the years if anyone was helping me practice at home, and I'd always said no. Dad's expression had shifted from angry to uncertain, and he kept looking at Rebecca with this confused look like he was trying to figure out a puzzle. Dad sat down in the armchair across from the couch and asked Rebecca directly if she could play any musical instrument at all. Rebecca's face went red again and she started crying harder, saying this was so unfair and everyone was ganging up on her. Mom immediately jumped to Rebecca's defense, saying she was clearly overwhelmed by everything that had happened, and we should give her some space instead of interrogating her. I felt this surge of pure frustration wash over me, because even with Mrs. Yoshida's detailed records and proof that I'd been hiding my piano practice from Rebecca, my parents were still protecting her. Dad looked like he wanted to ask more questions, but Mom gave him this look that meant drop it, so he sighed and said we should all go to bed and talk more in the morning when everyone had calmed down. I barely slept that night because I kept replaying the talent show and the car ride and the conversation at home over and over in my mind. The next morning, I came downstairs and found Rebecca already in the kitchen with Mom making breakfast. Rebecca was telling Mom that maybe she'd exaggerated her role in my piano playing a little bit, but she definitely had helped me with my other achievements like guitar and art and writing. She said she'd been there supporting me and giving me advice even if she hadn't literally taught me every single note. Mom was nodding and flipping pancakes while saying that sounded reasonable, and maybe we all just needed to move forward without dwelling on the past. I poured myself orange juice and felt my stomach twist because Rebecca was already pivoting to defend all her other lies, and Mom was letting her do it. Monday morning came and I walked into school feeling nervous about what people would say after the talent show. 3 different teachers stopped me in the hallway before first period even started, saying they'd heard about what happened and wanted to talk to me. Faith Cooper, my art teacher, pulled me aside near the lockers and asked directly if Rebecca had really helped me with the portrait I'd painted last semester. I told her the complete truth that Rebecca had never helped me with anything in my entire life, and all those claims about teaching me were total lies. Faith's expression got really serious, and she said she needed to talk to the principal about this because she had some concerns about things Rebecca had told her in the past. First period felt like it dragged on forever because I kept thinking about Faith wanting to talk to the principal about Rebecca's lies. When the bell finally rang, Faith caught up with me in the hallway and asked if I could come to her classroom during my free period. I nodded and spent the next hour barely paying attention in algebra because my mind kept going over everything Rebecca had claimed about teaching me art. During my free period, I walked to Faith's classroom and found her sitting at her desk with a folder open in front of her. She looked up when I came in and gestured for me to sit down. Faith opened the folder and pulled out several printed emails showing messages Rebecca had sent her last year. The first one was from October, asking if Faith could mention Rebecca's mentorship when discussing my portrait project with other teachers. Rebecca had written 3 paragraphs about the advanced painting techniques she'd supposedly taught me and how proud she was of my progress under her guidance. Faith showed me another email from December where Rebecca asked if she could be listed as a teaching assistant for the spring semester art class. She'd claimed she had extensive experience instructing younger students and wanted to formalize her role in my artistic development. I felt sick reading these emails because Rebecca had been building this fake narrative with my teachers behind my back for over a year. Faith said she'd felt something was off at the time because Rebecca's descriptions of painting techniques were vague and sometimes incorrect. She'd responded politely but never followed through on listing Rebecca as any kind of assistant. Now Faith wanted to take all this documentation to Principal Alexander and review every single claim Rebecca had made about teaching me. She said other teachers might have similar emails or conversations that needed to be examined. I thanked Faith for believing me and taking this seriously because it felt like the first time an adult was really listening. The cafeteria at lunch was worse than I expected. I grabbed my tray and headed toward my usual table when 3 girls from my English class surrounded me near the drink station. One of them asked if it was really true that Rebecca had been lying about teaching me stuff. I said yes, and explained that Rebecca had never taught me anything despite claiming credit for years. The girl nodded sympathetically and said she'd always thought it was weird how Rebecca talked about me like I was some project she'd fixed. Another classmate joined in, saying Rebecca had told her entire friend group that I'd be failing classes without her tutoring. I appreciated their support, but then 2 of Rebecca's friends walked past, and one of them said loud enough for everyone to hear that some people will do anything for attention, including trashing their own family. The other one added that Rebecca had always been nothing but nice to me, and I was being ungrateful. I felt my face get hot and my stomach started hurting because the social fallout was spreading faster than I'd anticipated. I sat down at my table and tried to eat, but I kept noticing people looking over and whispering. Rebecca was sitting with her usual group across the cafeteria, and every single one of them kept glaring at me like I'd committed some terrible crime. One girl at Rebecca's table pointed at me while talking, and the whole group turned to stare. My friend sitting next to me asked if I was okay, and I said I was fine, but my stomach felt like it was tied in knots. I'd known exposing Rebecca would have consequences, but actually experiencing everyone picking sides made me feel awful. Some students seemed supportive, and others acted like I was starting drama for no reason. The worst part was not knowing who believed what, or how many people Rebecca had already convinced with her version of events. After school, I was walking toward the bus when Rebecca appeared from around the corner near the gym. She stepped directly into my path, and her face was red and her eyes looked furious. She said I'd ruined her reputation and made her look like a liar in front of everyone who mattered. I tried to step around her, but she moved to block me again. Rebecca insisted she'd only been trying to help me gain confidence by sharing credit for my work. She said I was too shy and insecure to take credit myself, so she'd done it for me as a favor. I told her that stealing credit for work she didn't do wasn't sharing, and it definitely wasn't helping me. Rebecca's voice got louder, and she said I should be grateful she'd made me look good instead of letting me stay invisible. I felt anger rising in my chest, and I said, taking credit for achievements I earned myself while telling everyone I needed her help to function wasn't making me look good. Rebecca stepped closer and hissed that I was ungrateful and selfish, and I'd regret humiliating her publicly. Then she turned and stormed off toward the parking lot where her aunt was waiting. I stood there shaking because the confrontation had been so intense, and Rebecca genuinely seemed to believe she'd been doing me some kind of favor. The bus pulled up and I got on feeling exhausted and upset. I found a seat near the back and stared out the window trying to process everything that had happened in one day. That evening I was in my room doing homework when I heard the house phone ring downstairs. Dad answered and I heard him say Faith's name, so I crept to the top of the stairs to listen. Faith was explaining that she had documentation of Rebecca making false claims about teaching me art. She mentioned she'd spoken with other teachers who had similar concerns about Rebecca's pattern of taking credit for my work. Dad's voice sounded serious as he asked questions and took notes. The conversation lasted about 15 minutes, and when Dad hung up, he called Rebecca down to the living room. I stayed at the top of the stairs listening as Dad asked Rebecca to sit down for a serious conversation. Mom came in from the kitchen and sat on the couch looking worried. Dad said Faith had called with some concerning information about claims Rebecca had made regarding teaching me art. He asked Rebecca to explain specifically what she'd taught me in my art class. Rebecca gave vague answers about color theory and something about brush techniques for shading. Dad pressed for more details, and Rebecca said she'd shown me how to mix colors and plan compositions. Mom nodded along like this sounded reasonable, but Dad kept asking more specific questions. He asked Rebecca to describe the portrait project I'd done last semester, and Rebecca said it was a face using oils. Dad pointed out that I'd actually used acrylics, not oils, and the project was a full figure portrait, not just a face. Rebecca stammered that she'd mixed up the details, but she definitely remembered helping me with it. Dad asked her to demonstrate any painting technique she'd supposedly taught me, and Rebecca said she didn't have her supplies with her. Mom suggested maybe Rebecca could show us another time, but Dad's expression showed he wasn't buying the excuse. He said Faith had emails where Rebecca claimed extensive knowledge of advanced painting techniques, but couldn't answer basic questions about the actual projects. Rebecca's face went red, and she insisted Faith was misremembering their conversations. Dad asked why Faith would make up emails, and Rebecca said maybe Faith was confused or trying to cause problems. The excuses were starting to sound hollow even to Mom, whose expression shifted from defensive to uncertain. Over the next few days, I started documenting everything I could remember about Rebecca's false claims. I opened a notebook and wrote down dates as accurately as I could recall. I listed the math homework she'd claimed to teach me in September 3 years ago. I wrote about the cookies for the fundraiser in October that same year. I documented the portrait she'd posted online saying she taught me to paint. I added the short story competition where she claimed to have edited and rewritten my work. I listed the guitar claims and the piano lies, and every single time she'd told someone she was coaching me or tutoring me or teaching me anything. For each incident, I wrote down who had heard her make the claim and where it happened. I included teachers' names and classmates' names and relatives who'd been told these lies at family gatherings. I wrote down the science fair where she told judges she'd helped design my experiments. I documented the award ceremony where she tried to accept recognition on my behalf. I added the talent show and everything that happened there, including witnesses. The list grew longer and longer until it filled 3 full pages in my notebook. Each entry represented something I'd accomplished completely on my own that Rebecca had stolen. Seeing it all written out made the pattern obvious and undeniable. 2 full years of systematic credit theft spanning every area of my life. I felt angry looking at those pages, but also relieved because now I had concrete documentation, instead of just my word against hers. Rebecca started her own campaign at the school telling anyone who would listen that I was jealous of her because she was older and more accomplished. I heard from friends that she was describing the talent show as me having a breakdown from performance pressure. She told people I'd always been competitive with her and couldn't handle her being better at things. She claimed I'd planned the whole public confrontation because I wanted attention and sympathy. Some students who didn't know us well seemed to believe her version of events. I'd hear whispers in the hallway about how sad it was that I was so jealous of my own sister. Rebecca's friends spread the story that I'd always resented her for being prettier and smarter and more talented. They said I was making up lies about her stealing credit, because I couldn't accept that she was just naturally better than me. The counter-narrative was working on people who only knew us casually. But students who'd been in classes with me or seen my actual work seemed more skeptical of Rebecca's story. My art teacher made a point of showing my portfolio to other students when they asked about the situation. My English teacher told several people that I'd written all my competition pieces during class time, where Rebecca couldn't possibly have helped. The truth was spreading, but so were Rebecca's lies, and I couldn't control which version people chose to believe. Mrs. Yoshida sent an email to my parents offering to meet with them in person, to discuss everything she'd observed over 3 years of teaching me piano. She wrote that in her 20 years of teaching, she'd never seen a case of credit theft this systematic and deliberate. She said she had detailed records and documentation that proved Rebecca had played no role in my musical education. She offered several possible meeting times and said she felt it was important for my parents to understand the full scope of what had been happening. Mom read the email while I was eating breakfast and she looked upset. She said she didn't understand why Mrs. Yoshida was making such a big deal out of this. Dad said they should take the meeting seriously because Mrs. Yoshida was a respected teacher with no reason to lie. Mom argued that maybe everyone was overreacting and we should just move forward as a family. Dad insisted they needed to hear what Mrs. Yoshida had to say. They finally agreed to meet with her the following Tuesday after school. Mom seemed reluctant the whole time, like she still didn't want to face the truth about what Rebecca had done. Tuesday afternoon, my parents drove to the school for the meeting with Mrs. Yoshida. I waited in the music room while they talked in Mrs. Yoshida's office. The meeting lasted over an hour, and when they came out, Mom's eyes were red like she'd been crying. We drove home in silence, and I could tell something significant had happened. After dinner, Dad asked me to come into the living room, and both my parents sat down looking serious. Dad said Mrs. Yoshida had shown them detailed records of every lesson I'd taken for 3 years. She'd brought attendance sheets and payment records and notes about my progress. She'd showed them the practice schedule proving I stayed after school every single day to practice because I'd specifically told her I needed privacy at home. Mom's voice shook when she said Mrs. Yoshida had explained that I'd explicitly mentioned hiding my progress from my stepsister. I nodded and confirmed that was true. Mom looked devastated hearing me say it out loud. Dad asked why I felt I needed to hide my accomplishments at home. I explained that every time I worked on something, Rebecca would find a way to claim credit for it, so I started keeping everything secret. I said I'd tried to tell them before, but Rebecca was always believed because she was older and more confident and better at talking to adults. Mom started crying again and said she was so sorry she hadn't listened. Dad looked angry, but not at me at the situation and probably at himself for not seeing it sooner. Mom's face crumpled and tears started rolling down her cheeks while she looked at me sitting on the couch. She said she felt horrible that I didn't feel heard for so long and she wished I'd come to her sooner. But then she wiped her eyes and said, maybe this whole thing was just a big misunderstanding that got out of hand. She suggested that Rebecca probably started helping me with something small, and then it grew into this bigger story that she couldn't back out of without looking bad. Dad shifted in his chair and his jaw tightened like he wasn't buying that explanation at all. He said deliberately lying to everyone for 2 years wasn't a misunderstanding. Mom looked at him with this pleading expression like she wanted him to agree with her version, where Rebecca wasn't actually a bad person. The tension between them felt thick and uncomfortable. The next day after school, I went to my room and pulled out my English folder from my backpack. I'd kept every graded essay and short story from the past 2 years, including the competition-winning piece that Rebecca claimed she'd basically rewritten. I carried the whole folder downstairs and spread the papers across the dining room table. Mom and Dad were in the kitchen making dinner, and I called them over. Every single paper had only my name at the top, and my teacher's comments in red pen with no mention anywhere of outside help or editing. Dad picked up the competition story and read through all 3 pages of teacher comments praising my original voice and creative plot structure. Mom looked through my other essays, and I watched her face change as she saw paper after paper with just my name and no evidence that Rebecca had touched any of them. Dad set down the story and said this was pretty clear proof. Mom nodded slowly, but she still looked like she was struggling to accept what the evidence showed. 2 days later, a thick envelope arrived in the mail addressed to my parents. Mom opened it at the kitchen table and pulled out a formal letter on the school letterhead. Faith Cooper had written 3 full pages documenting separate times when Rebecca approached her claiming credit for my artwork. She included exact dates and detailed conversations where Rebecca described techniques she'd supposedly taught me. Faith wrote that she'd asked Rebecca basic questions about color mixing and composition, and Rebecca's answers showed she had no actual art knowledge. At the bottom, Faith included her professional opinion as a teacher with 15 years of experience that Rebecca had deliberately misrepresented her involvement in my work. Dad read the letter twice and then handed it to Mom. Mom's hands shook a little as she read it. The letter used words like systematic pattern and deliberate deception. This wasn't just one teacher's observation anymore. This was official documentation from a school professional. That evening, Rebecca came home from her friend's house and Mom sat her down in the living room. I stayed in the hallway where I could hear everything. Mom's voice was gentle when she said they'd received some concerning information from my teachers. Rebecca immediately got defensive and said everyone was making a huge deal out of nothing. She claimed she was just trying to bond with me by being involved in my interests. And maybe she overstated her role a little, but her intentions were good. She said she just wanted to be a good big sister and help me feel confident. Mom's whole face softened and she reached over to squeeze Rebecca's hand. Mom said she understood that Rebecca was trying to connect with me, and that showed she cared. I felt my chest get tight with frustration, listening to Mom reframe 2 years of credit theft as sisterly bonding. Dad sat there not saying anything, but his expression looked skeptical. The following Monday, Dad told us at breakfast that he'd scheduled a meeting with the principal for Wednesday afternoon. Rebecca's fork clattered against her plate and she asked why he needed to involve the principal. Dad said he wanted to get a complete picture of what teachers had observed over the past 2 years. At the school on Wednesday, I went to the library during the meeting and tried to focus on homework, but I kept checking the clock. The meeting lasted almost 2 hours. When I got home that evening, both my parents looked serious. Dad said Principal Alexander had reviewed reports from 4 different teachers, and they all documented the same pattern of Rebecca claiming credit for my work. Dad used the word concerning 3 times while describing what the principal had told them. Mom looked uncomfortable, but didn't argue with what Dad was saying. Principal Alexander called our house the next evening and asked to speak with both my parents. I sat on the stairs listening to Dad's side of the conversation. He kept saying things like, "I understand, and that makes sense, and we appreciate your guidance." After he hung up, he told Mom that Principal Alexander explained this pattern suggested deeper issues that needed professional help. The principal had recommended family counseling and said if Rebecca were a student doing this, it would be considered academic dishonesty. Mom flinched when Dad said that last part. She said she didn't think it was fair to compare Rebecca to a cheating student because the situations were different. Dad asked how exactly they were different. Mom didn't have a good answer. That night, I was in my room trying to sleep when I heard raised voices coming from my parents' bedroom. I crept to my door and opened it a crack. Dad's voice came through clearly saying they needed to face facts that Rebecca had been systematically lying to everyone. Mom's voice got louder saying they couldn't destroy Rebecca's self-esteem by treating her like some kind of villain. Dad said protecting Rebecca's feelings wasn't more important than acknowledging what she'd done to me. Mom said Rebecca was struggling and needed support, not condemnation. Their voices went back and forth for over an hour, getting more frustrated. I heard Mom crying at one point. Eventually, everything went quiet, but I could tell neither of them had changed their mind. The next morning, Dad came into the kitchen where Rebecca and I were eating cereal and announced we were starting family counseling. His voice had this firm tone that meant he wasn't open to discussion. Rebecca's spoon stopped halfway to her mouth and she said she didn't need therapy. She said this whole thing was being blown way out of proportion and everyone was overreacting. Dad said it wasn't up for debate and we had our first appointment scheduled for Thursday. Mom stood by the counter looking torn between wanting to support Dad's decision and wanting to protect Rebecca from feeling attacked. She didn't say anything to contradict Dad, though. Rebecca shoved her bowl away and stomped upstairs. I just sat there feeling relieved that someone was finally taking this seriously. Thursday afternoon, we drove to a counseling office in a building downtown. The counselor's name was Alicia Zimmerman, and her office had comfortable chairs and tissues on every table. She asked us to introduce ourselves and explain why we were there. Rebecca jumped in first, saying there'd been some misunderstandings at the school that got blown out of proportion because I was sensitive about sharing credit. She made it sound like the whole thing was my fault for being insecure. Alicia wrote something in her notebook, and then asked Rebecca to explain specifically what she'd taught me in piano. Rebecca gave this long, vague answer about helping me understand rhythm and musical expression. Alicia asked what specific techniques Rebecca used to teach polyrhythms. Rebecca stammered that she didn't remember the exact methods. Alicia asked what key the Chopin piece was in. Rebecca said she wasn't sure off the top of her head. Even Mom looked skeptical now. Alicia took detailed notes the whole time and her face stayed neutral, but I could tell she was noticing how Rebecca couldn't answer basic questions. Then Alicia turned to me and asked how Rebecca's behavior had affected me over the past 2 years. I took a deep breath and explained that I'd started hiding all my work and achievements because I knew she'd find a way to steal credit. I said I stopped bringing projects home and practiced piano at the school instead of at home. I told her about teachers treating me like I was less capable because Rebecca had convinced them I needed constant help. I described feeling invisible in my own family because everything I did got credited to Rebecca. My voice cracked when I said I felt like nobody saw me for who I really was. Mom started crying again and reached for the tissue box. Dad's hand was clenched on the arm of his chair. Rebecca stared at the floor. Alicia wrote everything down and said we had a lot of work to do as a family. Our second counseling session happened the following week, and this time Alicia directed most of her questions at Rebecca. She asked Rebecca why she felt the need to claim credit for my work, and Rebecca immediately got defensive, saying the whole situation was being blown out of proportion. Alicia waited quietly until Rebecca ran out of steam, and then repeated the question more specifically, asking what Rebecca gained from pretending to teach me things she didn't know herself. Rebecca crossed her arms and stared at the floor for almost a full minute, before mumbling something about wanting to feel useful. Alicia leaned forward and asked her to speak up so everyone could hear. Rebecca said louder that she felt pressure to seem accomplished and helpful when she moved into our family. She admitted it started with small exaggerations about helping with homework, and then she couldn't figure out how to stop without admitting she'd been lying the whole time. Mom reached for tissues again, and Dad's jaw was tight. Alicia wrote notes and asked Rebecca if she understood how her behavior affected me and our family. Rebecca nodded but didn't elaborate, so Alicia pushed, asking her to use words. Rebecca said quietly that she knew it was wrong, but she didn't think anyone would find out. The honesty was almost worse than the lies, because it meant she'd actively calculated the risk of getting caught. Alicia set down her pen and explained in a calm but serious voice that this was a pattern of behavior that had damaged family trust and my sense of safety at home. She looked directly at my parents and said that Rebecca needed individual therapy to address whatever insecurities and self-esteem issues drove this compulsive credit theft. She used the phrase pathological lying, which made Mom flinch. Alicia said family counseling would continue, but Rebecca needed specialized help to understand why she felt so inadequate that she had to steal her younger sister's accomplishments. Rebecca's face went red and she looked like she wanted to argue, but she just sat there with her fists clenched. Dad asked what the next steps were, and Alicia said she'd provide referrals to therapists who specialized in adolescent behavioral issues. Mom asked if this meant Rebecca had some kind of disorder, and Alicia said it was too early for diagnosis, but the behavior pattern was concerning enough to warrant professional intervention. The session ended with Rebecca refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Over the following weeks at the school, things started shifting in small but noticeable ways. During music class, someone mentioned Rebecca teaching me guitar, and my music teacher immediately corrected them, saying I was completely self-taught. The clarification was public and matter-of-fact, and the other students looked surprised. In art class, when someone asked Faith if Rebecca had really helped with my portrait, she said firmly that Rebecca had never been involved in any of my art projects. Teachers were actively correcting the false narrative Rebecca had built, and each correction felt like a tiny piece of my reputation being restored. The drama club advisor asked me to help paint sets, and mentioned she'd heard great things about my independent artwork. The emphasis on independent was deliberate. My English teacher returned an essay with a note saying she was impressed by my consistent voice across all my writing, and she'd always known I worked alone. Even small moments like these accumulated into a pattern of social correction. Some of Rebecca's friends stopped talking to me completely, which actually felt like a relief. Kids who'd believed her stories now looked at me differently, some with sympathy and others with curiosity. The school gossip had shifted from Rebecca being my helpful mentor to Rebecca being exposed as a fraud. I didn't enjoy her humiliation, but I needed people to know the truth. One evening, Mom knocked on my bedroom door and asked if we could talk privately. We sat on my bed and she was quiet for a long time before saying she'd been in denial about the whole situation. She admitted that accepting the truth meant acknowledging she'd failed to protect me for 2 years. Her voice cracked when she said she should have noticed something was wrong when I started hiding all my projects and staying late at the school. She apologized for not believing me and for letting Rebecca's confident lies override my quiet truth. She said she'd been thinking about all the times I'd tried to tell her things weren't how Rebecca described them, and she'd dismissed my concerns as sibling rivalry. The apology wasn't perfect, and it didn't fix everything, but hearing her admit she'd been wrong mattered. She asked how she could make things better, and I told her I just needed her to see me for who I actually was, instead of filtering everything through Rebecca's version. Mom hugged me and promised she'd try harder to listen. It was a start, even if the damage couldn't be completely undone. Dad called a family meeting that weekend and announced new household rules. He said Rebecca was not allowed to discuss my achievements with anyone outside the family, without my explicit permission. Any claims about teaching me or helping me with projects had to be completely truthful and verifiable. If Rebecca violated these rules, there would be serious consequences, including restrictions on her social activities and phone use. Rebecca sat on the couch looking sulky, but she agreed to the rules without argument. Dad also said that from now on, he and Mom would be asking me directly about my work and accomplishments, instead of getting information secondhand through Rebecca. The rules felt necessary, but also sad that we needed formal restrictions to prevent my sister from stealing credit for my life. Rebecca went upstairs immediately after the meeting, and I heard her door slam. The new boundaries created tension in the house, but they also created space for me to exist without constant theft. Rebecca started individual therapy with a woman named Dr. Fleming, who specialized in adolescent behavioral issues. After her third session, Dr. Fleming called my parents in for a consultation without Rebecca present. I wasn't included, but I heard Mom and Dad talking about it later. Dr. Fleming had explained that Rebecca had significant self-esteem issues masked by outward confidence and social skills. She'd apparently spent most of her childhood being compared to more accomplished cousins, and felt like she could never measure up. When she moved into our family and saw me succeeding easily at things she struggled with, it triggered intense inadequacy. Dr. Fleming said the credit theft was Rebecca's maladaptive coping mechanism for feeling worthless. Mom kept saying this explained so much, and Dad agreed it provided context, even if it didn't excuse the behavior. I understood Rebecca had issues, but I was tired of her problems being used to minimize what she'd done to me. Having an explanation for why someone hurt you doesn't make the hurt disappear. At the school, I started being more open about my work instead of hiding everything. When I won another writing competition for a short story about family dysfunction, I made sure everyone knew I'd written it completely independently. My English teacher announced my win in class and specifically mentioned that the piece demonstrated my unique voice and perspective. Several teachers went out of their way to publicly acknowledge my individual talent in ways that felt deliberate and supportive. Faith asked if I wanted to enter a regional art show and said she'd write a recommendation letter emphasizing my independent development as an artist. Mrs. Yoshida suggested I audition for a youth orchestra and said my piano skills were advanced enough to compete at a high level. Being recognized for my own work without Rebecca's shadow felt strange at first. I'd spent so long hiding my accomplishments that claiming them publicly required conscious effort. But each time I accepted credit for something I'd actually done, it got a little easier to believe I deserved the recognition. In our next family therapy session, Rebecca made an apology that immediately felt wrong. She said she was sorry I felt hurt by her actions and sorry if she'd caused any misunderstandings. Alicia stopped her mid-sentence and said that wasn't a real apology. She explained that saying sorry you felt hurt put responsibility on me for my reaction, instead of on Rebecca for her actions. Alicia coached Rebecca through taking actual accountability, asking her to identify specifically what she'd done wrong and why it was harmful. Rebecca struggled with this for several minutes, making false starts and defensive statements. Finally, with visible effort, she said she was sorry for lying about teaching me things and stealing credit for my work. She admitted she'd deliberately deceived everyone, including our parents, for over 2 years. The apology was stilted and uncomfortable, but it was more honest than anything Rebecca had said before. Alicia asked how Rebecca planned to rebuild trust, and Rebecca said she didn't know, but she'd try to stop lying. It wasn't a transformation, but it was acknowledgement. Mom and Dad started asking me directly about my interests and what I was working on, instead of hearing about everything through Rebecca's filter. Dad asked about my piano practice, and I told him about the new pieces Mrs. Yoshida was teaching me. He seemed genuinely interested, so I invited him to observe one of my lessons. The following Tuesday, Dad sat in the back of Mrs. Yoshida's studio and watched me work through a Beethoven sonata. Afterward, he told Mrs. Yoshida he had no idea I was playing at such an advanced level. She showed him my progress record spanning 3 years and explained the technical difficulty of the pieces I'd mastered. Dad looked at me with something like wonder and said he was sorry he'd missed seeing this development happen. These small moments of being actually seen by my parents felt more important than big apologies. They were learning to know me as I actually existed instead of as Rebecca's project. 2 months after the talent show, Rebecca admitted something in her therapy session that Dr. Fleming later shared with my parents. Rebecca said she'd been jealous of my natural talents because she felt she had to work much harder for less recognition. She described watching me pick up piano and art and writing easily while she struggled with everything academic and creative. The jealousy made her feel inadequate, so she started claiming credit as a way to feel connected to success, even if it wasn't hers. Alicia used this admission in our family session to help Rebecca see that stealing credit hadn't solved her insecurity. If anything, it made her feel worse because she knew the praise wasn't real. Rebecca cried during this session, which was the first time I'd seen her show genuine emotion about the situation, rather than defensive anger. She said she understood now that she needed to find things she was actually good at instead of parasitically attaching to my achievements. It was progress even if it didn't undo the damage. I waited until the next family therapy session to say what needed to be said. Alicia had been working with Rebecca individually for weeks, and the change was small but visible. Rebecca sat across from me in the counselor's office looking tired instead of defensive. I took a breath and spoke directly to her for the first time since the talent show without our parents mediating. I told her that I understood she had issues and insecurities that drove her behavior. I said I knew she felt inadequate watching me succeed at things that came naturally to me. But I also told her that what she did to me for 2 years was cruel, and it damaged my trust in my own family. I explained that I started hiding every accomplishment because I couldn't trust anyone in our house to let me own my achievements. I said teachers thought I was stupid because she convinced them I needed constant help. I told her I felt invisible in my own life because she erased me from every success I worked for. Rebecca didn't interrupt or make excuses. She sat there listening with her hands folded in her lap. When I finished, she nodded slowly and said she knew she couldn't undo any of it. She said therapy was helping her see how toxic her behavior had been, and she wanted to try to be better. She didn't ask for forgiveness or make promises about our relationship. She just acknowledged what she'd done and said she was working on herself. It wasn't a transformation, but it was the first real accountability I'd gotten from her. The following Monday, I walked into the art room after school and told Faith I wanted to join the art club. She smiled and handed me a membership form immediately. I'd been avoiding extracurricular activities for 2 years because Rebecca always found ways to insert herself into anything I participated in. Now I could finally do things openly without fear. I also joined the creative writing club that met on Thursdays. Both clubs felt like spaces where I could exist as myself without Rebecca's shadow hanging over me. Faith started mentoring me on building a portfolio of my best work. She pulled out paintings and drawings I'd submitted for class over the past year and helped me photograph them properly. She explained composition and how to present my work professionally. Having a teacher invest time in developing my actual talents instead of correcting Rebecca's false narrative felt amazing. Other students in art clubs started recognizing my style and asking about my techniques. Nobody mentioned Rebecca at all. I was just Jessie who painted landscapes with unusual color choices. Being known for my own work instead of as Rebecca's supposed student felt like breathing clean air after years in a smoky room. Rebecca started showing up to dinner talking about debate team practice. At first I thought she was setting up another scheme to steal credit from someone else. But she kept going to practices and coming home with notes about argumentation strategies. She'd talk to Dad about logical fallacies and how to structure rebuttals. One night she mentioned winning a practice debate against a senior, and she seemed genuinely excited. Mom asked her about it, and Rebecca described her arguments in detail without claiming anyone had coached her or helped her prepare. She was owning her achievement completely. The debate coach told our parents that Rebecca had natural talent for public speaking and quick thinking under pressure. Having her own success seemed to reduce her need to parasitically attach to mine. We'd pass each other in the hallway at the school, and she'd be carrying debate materials instead of lurking near my classrooms. She found friends on the debate team who knew her for her actual skills. Watching her develop her own identity separate from stealing mine was strange but necessary. I didn't trust her completely, but I could see she was trying to build something real for herself. 3 months after the talent show, my parents called both of us into the living room for a family meeting. I felt my stomach tighten expecting another lecture about family unity or forgiving Rebecca. Instead, Dad sat forward with his hands clasped and said they needed to acknowledge something important. He said they had failed to see the unhealthy dynamic that developed in our household. He admitted he was too quick to believe Rebecca because she seemed confident and helpful while I was younger and quieter. He said he should have questioned why I never wanted to share my work at home or why I practiced piano at the school instead of using our piano. Mom spoke next and said she was learning to question surface appearances. She explained that she'd always assumed older siblings naturally helped younger ones, and she never considered that Rebecca's involvement might be false. She apologized for dismissing my attempts to tell them the truth. She said watching me thrive now that Rebecca wasn't claiming credit showed her how much damage the dynamic had caused. They both said they were committed to creating a healthier family environment going forward. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was real acknowledgement that they'd failed me. Alicia used our next family session to establish new communication patterns. She explained that our household had developed a hierarchy based on age and confidence level, rather than valuing everyone's voice equally. She had us practice scenarios where I could speak up about problems without being dismissed or talked over. We role-played situations where Rebecca tried to take credit, and I had to assert myself while my parents listened, instead of automatically believing the older sister. The exercises felt awkward and artificial, but Alicia insisted they were necessary to break old patterns. She made Rebecca practice asking about my activities without inserting herself into them. She had my parents practice checking facts before accepting Rebecca's claims. We spent an hour going through hypothetical situations and appropriate responses. Mom kept apologizing during the exercises, saying it felt silly to rehearse basic communication. Alicia explained that our family had normalized dysfunction for so long that we needed explicit practice doing things differently. By the end of the session, I felt exhausted, but slightly hopeful that things might actually change. Rebecca and I had a private conversation the following week where we established clear boundaries. We agreed that we would maintain polite distance and not pretend to be close sisters. We'd be civil at family dinners and acknowledge each other at the school, but we wouldn't hang out or share details about our lives. We wouldn't go to each other's events unless specifically invited. We wouldn't comment on each other's achievements or activities. The boundaries felt sad in some ways because stepsisters were supposed to bond and become friends. But pretending everything was fine would have been worse. Our relationship was functional, if not warm. We could exist in the same house without constant conflict, but we weren't going to force closeness that didn't exist. Both of us seemed relieved to have explicit rules instead of navigating unclear expectations. I didn't hate Rebecca anymore, but I didn't trust her either. The distance felt realistic given what had happened. I had another piano recital in early December, and this time Rebecca didn't attend. Mom asked if I wanted her to come, and I said no immediately. The relief on Rebecca's face when I declined was visible. She didn't want to watch me perform any more than I wanted her there. Mom and Dad came and sat in the front row with flowers. I played a Debussy piece and a Bach invention that Mrs. Yoshida had helped me prepare. After the performance, my parents waited in the lobby while other families congratulated their kids. When other parents approached to compliment my playing, Mom and Dad introduced me as their talented daughter, without any mention of Rebecca's involvement. Dad told one couple that I'd been taking lessons for years and working incredibly hard. Mom showed them a video she'd taken of my performance. Nobody asked about Rebecca or whether she'd taught me. The correction in how my parents presented me felt good. I was finally visible as myself instead of as Rebecca's supposed project. At the school, my reputation as an independent achiever became firmly established. New students who transferred in during the spring semester knew me for my own work. They'd heard I played piano and painted and wrote stories, but nobody mentioned Rebecca at all. Teachers started recommending me for advanced programs based on my individual merit. My English teacher nominated me for a regional writing workshop. Faith submitted my portfolio to a young artists showcase. The music department asked me to perform at the spring concert. All of these opportunities came from people recognizing my actual abilities instead of believing Rebecca's false narrative. I was finally visible as myself. Classmates would ask me for help with art projects or writing assignments. Nobody treated me like I needed assistance or spoke to me slowly. The 2 years of being seen as incompetent were finally being erased by consistent evidence of my real capabilities. Rebecca made genuine progress in her individual therapy sessions. Her therapist helped her develop healthier self-esteem, not based on taking credit for other people's work. One afternoon, Rebecca asked Mom to drive her to the school, and she went into the building for over an hour. When she came back out, Mom asked what she'd been doing. Rebecca said she'd apologized to several of my teachers for misleading them about teaching me. She'd gone to Faith's classroom and admitted she'd lied about helping with my artwork. She'd found my English teacher and confessed she'd never edited my writing. She'd tracked down Mrs. Yoshida and apologized for claiming she taught me piano. The apologies were uncomfortable and humiliating for Rebecca, but they showed real accountability. Faith told me later that Rebecca's apology seemed genuine and painful. She said Rebecca cried while admitting she'd made up the whole story about teaching me to paint. The teachers appreciated the accountability, even though it didn't undo the damage to my reputation over the past 2 years. 4 months after the talent show, I entered a regional art competition and won first place in my age category. The local newspaper sent a reporter to interview me about my work. I sat in our living room answering questions about my artistic process and my influences. I talked about Faith's mentorship and how she'd helped me develop my portfolio. I mentioned teaching myself techniques through online tutorials and practice. I described my grandmother's encouragement of my creativity when I was younger. I gave credit where it was actually due without inflating anyone's role. The reporter asked if anyone in my family was artistic, and I said my parents were supportive, but not artists themselves. Rebecca's name never came up in the conversation. When the article came out the following week, it featured a photo of me with one of my paintings and quotes about my dedication and natural talent. Rebecca didn't try to insert herself into the story at all. She read the article at breakfast and said congratulations before going back to her debate team notes. The fact that she could let me have an achievement completely to myself felt like real progress. A week after the newspaper article came out, Mom knocked on my bedroom door while I was practicing a new piece. She sat on my bed and watched me finish the phrase before speaking. She told me she was proud of how I stood up for myself at the talent show, even though it was painful for the family. She said I showed courage she wished she'd had at my age. Dad came in a few minutes later and agreed, adding that watching me advocate for myself taught him to listen better. They both apologized again for taking so long to see what was really happening. Mom's eyes got wet when she said she kept replaying moments from the past 2 years in her head, seeing them completely differently now. Dad squeezed my shoulder and said they were committed to making sure I felt heard and valued going forward. The conversation felt genuine in a way that previous apologies hadn't, like they were finally processing the full weight of what Rebecca had done. The following Tuesday, we had another family therapy session with Alicia. This time, she said Rebecca and I needed to have a direct conversation about everything that happened. Rebecca sat across from me looking uncomfortable but not defensive like she used to. Alicia prompted her to take full responsibility without excuses or justifications. Rebecca took a deep breath and said she was sorry for 2 years of systematic credit theft. She said the words slowly like she'd practiced them. She acknowledged the harm she caused to my self-esteem and family relationships. She admitted she'd made me feel invisible in my own home and undermined my confidence with teachers and relatives. She said she knew saying sorry didn't fix what she'd done, but she wanted me to know she understood how wrong it was. Her voice cracked a little when she talked about making me hide my work because I couldn't trust my own family. I listened without interrupting, watching her face to see if she really meant it. When she finished, I told her I was accepted her accountability, even though rebuilding trust would take time. I said I appreciated her finally being honest, but actions would matter more than words. Alicia nodded and said that was a healthy boundary to set. 3 weeks later, Mrs. Yoshida called me into her office after my piano lesson. She had papers spread across her desk and a big smile on her face. She told me she'd nominated me for a youth music scholarship through the Regional Arts Foundation. She'd already written a recommendation letter detailing my dedication and natural talent. She showed me the letter, and I read phrases about my commitment to practicing and my ability to master difficult pieces independently. She mentioned that I'd overcome significant obstacles to pursue my passion, which I knew meant Rebecca's interference. Mrs. Yoshida said the scholarship would cover advanced lessons with a university professor and potential competition entry fees. I had to submit an audition video and essay about my musical journey. The application deadline was in 6 weeks. I felt this rush of excitement mixed with nervousness about being evaluated by people I'd never met. Mrs. Yoshida squeezed my hand and said she had complete confidence in my abilities. 2 months later, I got the acceptance letter in the mail. The scholarship would fund 2 years of advanced lessons starting that summer. That spring, we had a family dinner where Rebecca mentioned winning an award from her debate team for Best Speaker in regional competition. She showed us the trophy and talked about the tournament. Mom and Dad congratulated her and asked questions about her arguments and opponents. Nobody questioned whether the achievement was really hers. Nobody asked if someone had helped her or coached her speeches. We just celebrated something she'd actually accomplished through her own work. Rebecca noticed the difference too because she looked almost relieved when the conversation stayed focused on her genuine effort. After dinner, she thanked Mom and Dad quietly for believing her. The fact that we could celebrate her real achievements without suspicion felt like progress. She seemed to appreciate being recognized for something she actually did, instead of something she'd stolen from me. In May, I started teaching beginner piano to younger students at the community center. The director had heard about my scholarship and asked if I'd be interested in working with kids who couldn't afford private lessons. I taught 3 students every Saturday morning, showing them basic scales and simple songs. A 7-year-old named Clyde struggled with reading notes but loved making up melodies. I helped him learn to play by ear while gradually introducing written music. An 11-year-old girl named Sophia was shy but had good natural rhythm. I worked with her on building confidence to play in front of others. Teaching them gave me this sense of joy that felt completely different from my own practicing. Several parents commented on my patience and skill after watching their kids' progress. One mom said her daughter talked about me all week and practiced without being reminded. Being on the teaching side of music felt powerful after years of having false teaching claims made about me. I was actually helping these kids learn, and nobody was stealing credit for their improvement. Rebecca graduated high school in early June. The ceremony was held in the football stadium with hundreds of families watching. She wore her blue cap and gown and walked across the stage to get her diploma. Our parents threw a graduation party at our house the following weekend with relatives and Rebecca's friends. I helped set up tables in the backyard and hung congratulations banners. During the party, Rebecca gave a short speech thanking everyone for their support. Near the end, she looked at me and said she wanted to thank her sister Jessie for being talented and inspiring. She said watching me pursue my passions with dedication taught her about real commitment. She didn't claim any credit for my achievements or suggest she'd helped me in any way. It was a small acknowledgement, but it felt meaningful coming from her in front of everyone. Several relatives came up to me afterward saying they were impressed by Rebecca's maturity. Her aunt mentioned that Rebecca would be attending college in another state starting in August. The physical distance would be healthy for both of us. After Rebecca left for college in late August, home life became noticeably calmer. I could leave my artwork on the kitchen table without worrying someone would photograph it and claim they'd taught me. I could talk about my writing projects at dinner without fear of Rebecca inserting herself into the story. My sheet music stayed on the piano instead of hidden in my room. Mom and Dad continued working on seeing me clearly and supporting my individual growth. Dad started asking specific questions about my music theory homework instead of assuming I needed help. Mom came to my art club meetings and watched me work without suggesting Rebecca should be there too. We had conversations where they actually listened when I talked about my interests and goals. The family dynamic improved significantly without the constant tension of Rebecca's lies hanging over everything. That spring, I performed a senior recital at the end of the school year. Mrs. Yoshida helped me select 6 pieces ranging from Bach to contemporary composers. The program included the Chopin Ballade that started everything at the talent show 2 years earlier. I practiced for months, working through difficult passages and refining my interpretation. The recital was held in the school auditorium on a Saturday evening. The room filled with people who knew my real story, teachers and students and parents who'd watched me grow as a musician. Mrs. Yoshida introduced me as one of the most dedicated students she'd taught in her 20-year career. She talked about my perseverance and natural musicality. I walked onto the stage feeling nervous but ready. The piano bench felt familiar under me as I began the first piece. Each note came out clear and confident. Between pieces, I looked out at the audience and saw Faith sitting with other teachers. My parents sat in the 3rd row smiling. When I finished the Chopin Ballade, the audience stayed silent for a moment before erupting in applause. After the recital ended, people came up to talk to me in the lobby. Several audience members said they remembered the talent show exposure and were impressed by how I'd continued to grow and succeed. Faith hugged me and said my playing had been beautiful. A woman I didn't recognize introduced herself as Penelope Harden, the piano teacher who'd questioned Rebecca at the talent show. She said her daughter looked up to me for standing up for the truth. She told me that moment had sparked conversations in their family about honesty and taking credit for your own work. Other parents and students offered congratulations and asked about my college plans. Mrs. Yoshida stood nearby looking proud. The vindication felt complete, not because I'd proven Rebecca wrong, but because I was recognized purely for my own abilities and hard work. 2 weeks later, I received acceptance letters from multiple colleges with strong music and art programs. I'd applied to 7 schools, submitting portfolios of my artwork and audition recordings of my piano playing. Every application was entirely my own work, from the essays about my artistic journey to the pieces I'd selected to showcase my abilities. The applications required no mention of Rebecca, because she genuinely played no role in my development. I'd listed Mrs. Yoshida and Faith as references along with my academic teachers. 5 schools accepted me with various scholarship offers. I was recognized purely for my own merit, evaluated by admissions committees who'd never heard Rebecca's false claims. Mom and Dad helped me compare financial aid packages and visit campuses. We toured music facilities and art studios, imagining where I might spend the next 4 years. I chose a school 3 hours away with a strong piano program and excellent art department. The acceptance letter sat on my desk where I could see it every day, proof that my achievements belonged to me alone. The week before I left for college, Rebecca knocked on my bedroom door while I was packing boxes of art supplies and sheet music. She stood in the doorway looking uncomfortable, picking at her fingernail polish the way she did when she was nervous. She asked if we could talk for a minute, and I nodded, moving a stack of books off my desk chair so she could sit down. Rebecca sat and stared at her hands for a long moment before looking up at me. She told me she was genuinely proud of everything I'd accomplished, and she regretted that she'd damaged our relationship by trying to claim my achievements as her own. Her voice was quiet and steady, not defensive the way it used to be when confronted. She said therapy had helped her understand that she'd been trying to feel valuable by connecting herself to my success, instead of developing her own worth. She admitted that watching me excel at so many things had made her feel inadequate, like she had nothing of her own to offer, so she'd convinced herself that being my mentor was her contribution. Rebecca said she knew now that was completely wrong and unfair to me, and she was sorry for the 2 years of lies and manipulation. She didn't make excuses or try to minimize what she'd done. I sat on my bed across from her, processing her words. I told her I appreciated the apology, and I could see she'd done real work in therapy. I said I hoped college would give her the chance to build an identity based on her actual strengths and interests, not borrowed from someone else's accomplishments. Rebecca nodded and said she was looking forward to starting fresh somewhere nobody knew her as my sister. We talked for another 20 minutes about practical things, like how we'd handle family holidays and whether we'd stay in touch regularly. We agreed to maintain polite distance and maybe someday rebuild a relationship based on honesty instead of the toxic dynamic we'd had. I told her I wasn't ready to be close, but I didn't hate her, and I understood she'd been struggling with her own issues. Rebecca stood up to leave and paused at the door, turning back to say she hoped I'd have an amazing college experience without her shadow hanging over everything. It wasn't a fairy tale reconciliation with tears and hugs, but it felt realistic and healthier than pretending everything was fine now. The morning I left for college, Dad loaded the last box into the car, while Mom triple-checked that I had everything on the dorm packing list. The 3-hour drive was mostly quiet, with occasional conversation about my class schedule and roommate assignment. When we pulled up to the brick dormitory building, other families were already unloading cars and carrying furniture up the front steps. Dad grabbed the heaviest boxes while Mom carried my desk lamp and bedding. We made 4 trips up to the 3rd floor, passing other students and parents doing the same organized chaos of move-in day. My room was small with 2 beds, 2 desks, and 1 window overlooking the campus quad. My roommate hadn't arrived yet, so I picked the bed on the left and started unpacking. Mom made my bed with the sheets we'd bought specifically for the extra-long twin mattress, while Dad assembled the small bookshelf I'd brought. After an hour of unpacking and organizing, most of my belongings had found places in drawers and closet space. We went to lunch at a restaurant near campus, and Dad told me he was sorry it had taken a public confrontation at the talent show for them to see the truth about Rebecca's behavior. He said he felt guilty that I'd suffered for 2 years before they believed me, and he was grateful I'd had the courage to expose what was happening, even though it was uncomfortable for everyone. Mom reached across the table and squeezed my hand, saying that watching me continue to grow and succeed despite Rebecca's constant interference had shown her how genuinely strong I was. She said she'd been so focused on helping Rebecca adjust to the blended family that she'd failed to protect me from Rebecca's manipulation. Dad added that they'd both learned a hard lesson about listening to the quieter child instead of always believing the more confident one. I told them I appreciated the acknowledgement, and I was glad we'd all gotten help through family therapy. The rest of lunch was lighter, with Mom asking questions about my music scholarship and Dad wanting to know about the art facilities I'd toured during orientation. After my parents left and I finished unpacking, I sat at my new desk looking out the window at students walking across campus. My acceptance letter was pinned to the corkboard above the desk, along with the scholarship notification and a photo of me at my final recital. I thought about how the talent show confrontation 10 months ago had been the turning point where I stopped being invisible in my own life. Standing on that stage and publicly correcting the false narrative about Rebecca teaching me piano had been terrifying, but it had forced everyone to see the truth they'd been ignoring. I'd learned that speaking up for yourself isn't cruel even when it makes other people uncomfortable, and that real family support means being seen and believed, not just praised through someone else's lens. The months after the exposure had been hard, with family therapy sessions and difficult conversations, and the slow process of rebuilding trust. But those months had also shown me that I could advocate for myself and survive the fallout. I'd reclaimed my achievements and my identity, and now I was starting college as someone who was recognized for her own merit. My piano teacher knew my real skill level. My art teacher had documentation of my actual work. My college merit admissions file contained only my genuine accomplishments with no false claims attached. I was excited to build new achievements here that would be undeniably mine from the start, with no one stealing credit or undermining my competence. I opened my laptop and started exploring the music department website, looking at practice room schedules and upcoming recital opportunities. This was my fresh start, and for the first time in years, I felt completely free to succeed on my own terms.